Heresy Alpha, Book 1 of the Marian Imperium, by Richard Warren. Chapter 1, Marcus. The governor looked down upon the hateful city. Rain battered against the grimy windows of his office. Every droplet thumped at his temples. Marcus covered his face with his hands. "Damned migraine again," he muttered. He couldn't recall having one before he moved north. Things like migraines just didn't happen on the shores of the Bosphorus. From the Exarchate's 13th floor, he could see right across the sooty edifices of the cityscape below. The drab sandstone melded with the dirty window pane and the long streaks of rain. On this awful day, the whole of Caledon seemed to be clawing its way in. Hoping that a bit of fresh air might help, he unlatched the window. There was a terrible howl, and it was as if someone had chucked a calic of ice at his chin. With an effort, he hauled the window shut, cursing in Greek under his breath. How could this be May? "Barbaric place," he growled, gripping the windowsill. He oughtn't to complain. Coming to this backwater had been his idea, even if it had been the only way to secure his exarchal promotion. What had he expected? The weather, to say nothing of the locals, were hardly going to be of a mild Hellenic temperament. There was no point getting worked up about it now, especially not today. The migraine had been with him even before he'd got to the office that morning. He could still see the hologram of his wife sat opposite him in his study, the neon outline of her chiton oscillating in the Mediterranean breeze of her peristyle veranda. As usual, she had berated him for some trifle, but he'd understood what she really wanted to say. The same thing she had been saying for the last year since he'd arrived. You didn't have to take Caledonia. Such a backward, far-away place. You could have stayed here, but your promotion was more important than me, wasn't it? "May I, Exarch?" a voice broke in. Marcus started. Why did the local women have such deep voices? He raised his hand, soothingly cool from the window ledge, to his throbbing temple. As ever, his secretary had slipped in unnoticed. Polite but insistent, Severa was one of those officials whose tone always implied you'd forgotten something, regardless of whether you really had. Her name wasn't actually Severa, of course. It was Siobhan, but learning to pronounce impossible barbaric names was hardly why he'd been sent to the barren outpost. Severa was near enough, and in any case, it suited her. Marcus simply growled in response, the most his migraine would permit. The irascible blue scale of his wife's face, so devoid of any sympathy or understanding, still lingered before him. He'd teach Severa a lesson for coming in unannounced. She loitered before his desk, her shapely form little obscured by her dun standard-issue tunic and skirt. In fact, its hem was definitely a tad shorter than the office basilica decreed. Her bright blonde hair was rather loose too. His anger subsided. Their women certainly were uncouth, less polished and graceful than those of the South, but they weren't entirely without charm. Indeed, sometimes he felt the mother had made them a little too much in the image of Eve. The small, star-shaped green light, set over the icon of the Virgin above the door, paled to a faint shade of amber. Marcus's eye darted from Severa's skirt to the light, then dropped to the icon. He fingered the ring on his hand. "Yes, Sister Adjunct, what is the matter?" Marcus asked, focusing on Severa's forehead. He was annoyed at himself for such unsoldierly behaviour, and it was hardly the first time. The light slowly turned green again. "Only to remind you, Exarch, that your transit to the capital departs in 15 minutes, Severa replied. She assumed her official manner, but a smile lingered on the corners of her rosy lips. The races, of course. He was expected to be there for those too, not just the main event. How could he have completely forgotten? He'd never have done so in his prime, when he'd been a real soldier, when he'd still been master of his own destiny. The damned migraine wasn't helping either. His wife might have been kinder to him, at least today, of all days. "Vero, yes, yes," he stammered in Latin, trying to look unsurprised. "Full dress uniform, and be so kind as to bring some painkillers, will you?" he barked after Severa, as she disappeared as noiselessly as she had come. 15 minutes later, Marcus stepped into the parking lot, accompanied by Severa. His white, full-length uniform was stifling, with its high collar and heavy red matrician cuffs. A tight-fitting red beret, with its 3 solid gold laurels on one side, made it even worse, as if a snake from his native Syria had coiled itself around his brain. The headlights of his vehicle, the official electric, were already on. Constantin, his military tribune, held the door open. Well over 1.5 passes, with close-cropped hair, he too wore the white dress uniform, though in his case without the red cuffs, and sporting just a single leaf on his beret. Marcus inwardly thanked the Virgin. There was only so much that could go wrong with the sturdy Novgorovian at one side. He nodded as he clambered into the electric, which felt particularly low to the ground today. Mercifully, Severa did not start chattering as she got in beside him. Constantin was his usual laconic self, mute and motionless in front. Marcus lounged back in the leather seat. This was the last thing he needed today. Rain lashed the windows of the car as it pulled into the busy streets of Caledon. An awful throng of plebs slipped about on the cobbles, hastening to evade the governor's convoy as it rushed by. It wasn't the usual bustle of traders and slaves today, for today was the 29th of May, the feast of Our Lady of Battlement, and all the idlers were out looking for a bit of fun, or trouble. As the car left the narrow side streets and emerged onto the Imperial Mile, Caledon's Magistral, the medieval castle appeared. It looked particularly foreboding today, high up on the hill and half obscured by storm clouds. Torrents of rainwater rushed from its battlements down its sheer black walls. Marcus didn't like barbarians, but he had to give it to them. Had the walls of Mariupol been built like those 5.5 centuries earlier, they'd not have needed the Virgin to save them. Then there'd have been no need of today's celebration, and he might have stayed put. Tenebrae, Severa commanded. The windows dimmed. The saluting soldiers lining the mile became no more than a blur, as did the mass of soaking humanity they held back. The russet heads of the slave children and the shredded banners with which they had clothed themselves faded into an unobtrusive blue scale. Marcus thanked the Virgin again. There was quite enough of that to come today. The car left the city and pulled onto the highway. The road sign, Eboracum CC Mille Passus, appeared through the windscreen. 200 versts to the capital. That was plenty of time for a quick nap. Estimated arrival in 32 minutes, Constantin said. Lulled by the hum of the electric as it accelerated to full speed, Marcus's mind wandered. His window adumbrated the dim forms of the other vehicles, motionless but for the rush of the landscape beyond. Our Lady of Vindolanda flew by on a hilltop, the granite of her colossal helmet, breastplate, and outstretched gauntlets blackened by centuries of weathering. It was warm. His head nodded. "Shall I start your briefing, Exarch?" Severa's bass cut into Marcus's reverie. He grumbled and sat up, waving his hand. "Ad gubernatorem Caledoniae consilium," Severa said, requesting the relevant briefing. The dashboard responded, asking for the password. The windscreen dimmed, then lit up with a large white hologram of the letters S, P, Q, M, the seal of the Senate and the people. Beneath was a double-headed eagle with outspread wings, and, above both, the star of the Virgin. The hologram faded, replaced by the title of the requested report. "In nomine Matris et Virginis et Spiritus Sancti," the recording began, with the usual invocation, "in the name of the Mother, the Virgin, and the Holy Spirit." Marcus bit his lip. Latin spoken in that rough Caledonian accent always grated. Why couldn't his officials learn the language properly? The Hispanians and Numidians he'd commanded before had never struggled. It was deliberate obstinacy. First up were the military reports from the frontier, the usual trouble in the highlands, the usual agitators. He strummed on his armrest. He'd heard it all before and was bored. "Dispatch the 20th, no more than 2 centuries, he instructed the dashboard. The record cut short, skipping on to the naval report. There was nothing new, just summaries of radar activity and threat assessments for the Septentrion Sea. Then the killer blow, the publican's report on the tax take. He leaned against the window, trying to soothe his pulsing temple. Sub rosa consilium, the dashboard announced. Marcus bolted upright. Classified reports. That was unusual. Highly unusual. Military intelligence rarely remembered Britannia, let alone Caledonia, and when they did, it was rarely good news. Occulte, Marcus ordered. A holographic veil appeared, obscuring him behind a soundproof barrier. At least now he could ogle in peace. Admiring Severa's shapely thighs on the seat next to him, he sighed, then spoke the cryptographic key. Classified report. Tier secret. Origin, signals intelligence. Named recipients only, the automated prescript stated. It then named all the proconsuls and exarchs of the outer occidental provinces, who could be counted on 2 hands. It was odd, all very odd. The briefing started, an intelligence officer speaking Greek, while all other legionary and thematic commands and the civil consistoria were obliged to use Latin for official correspondence. Military intelligence simply dispensed with that formality altogether. They were barely accountable to anyone, save the Empress herself. They were hardly going to be chided for their Latin grammar. He didn't care about that, though. The sound of his native tongue, softly and correctly spoken, was a relief in itself. Intercepted enemy communications show heightened concern with seditious activity in southern provinces of the Caliphate, the report stated. Well, they certainly weren't alone there. He had no end of such trouble himself. Reports to Caliphate High Command and Committee of the Whole in recent months indicate increased monitoring of a popular movement in southern Asian provinces. Movement is understood to be of a dissenting religious affiliation. Must be something their lot had been working up to destabilise the Caliphate, keeping them busy so they wouldn't bother the Imperium too much. That sort of thing. The usual game. The sign of the false prophet has been seen. The briefing continued. Marcus started. He had been wrong. It was definitely not their lot. They'd never take a risk instigating something of that nature. He started paying attention. Exact nature of disturbance remains unclear. Decentralized in several locations across Caliphate Pashalik of Asia Meridiana. No consistent pattern emerges from intercepts beyond use in all cases of the sign of the false prophet. Priority mandates to all proconsuls, exarchs and legionary and thematic commands to report immediately any evidence of contagion. Alert level, Heresy Alpha. The report terminated. The sign of the false prophet, the Alpha Heresy, in an intelligence report, in the Caliphate, of all places. It made him uncomfortable after what had happened 5 months earlier. Outside, the Septentrion Sea was collapsing furiously against the cliffs of eastern Anglia. The painkillers hadn't helped. He scowled at Severa through the privacy shield, cradling his bald head. The day was getting more trying by the hour, and they hadn't even arrived yet. Still, orders were orders, and he must carry them out. Finite, he said, and the holographic veil disappeared. Sovereign mandate to all legates, tribunes and praetoria. Heresy vigilance level raised to severe. Severa raised her plucked eyebrows. He ignored her. The electric decelerated and exited the highway. They had reached the provincial capital, Eboracum, and would be at the stadium in a few minutes. Marcus straightened out his uniform, brushing down his already spotless doublet. The stadium was located just outside the medieval walls. That was typical in the northern provinces. In the period of their ignorance outside the empire, their peoples had forgotten how to build anything but castles or the most primitive temples in honour of their false prophet. Stadia like this had only been put up 4 centuries ago, after the second reintegration of the West. At least that meant the facilities would be modern, unlike everything else up north. 5 stories high, it towered over the old limestone walls, vying with the skyscrapers of central Eboracum in the distance. Clustered beneath the walls was a servile shanty town, stretching as far as the eye could see. A group of slave children had already spotted the governor's retinue arriving. They ran up to the windows, pointing at their open mouths in a fruitless attempt at an extra ration on the feast day. Marcus averted his eyes. "Your escort is ready, Exarch," Constantin said, as the car came to a halt. Marcus eyed the throng of waiting humanity and prayed the Virgin be kind. Even with the electric soundproofing, a low rumble was audible. It rose and fell, like the waves of the Septentrion, beating on his aching temples. He opened the door. It was as if he'd surfaced above the waves. He was clobbered by the hideous roar of 50,000 voices and blinded by Aboricum's clear skies. He swayed, but Constantin steadied him. He was getting too old for this. His instinctive authority soon returned to him. He surveyed the legionary guard of honour lining the red carpet, examining especially his own Caledonian legionnaires. Interspersed among those of Anglia and Gallia Minor, they stood to attention in the same white doublets, with the red Marian star and golden SPQM lettering on their epaulets, but were easily distinguishable by their kilts. Constantin led on, 3 more tribunes flanking Marcus on either side. As the defile passed, the legionnaires saluted, hoisting their assault rifles. He touched the laurels on his beret. They were well turned out today. At least something was going well, but this was the easy bit. Marcus ignored the mass of slaves beyond, most of whom wore frayed tunics or threadbare blouses, but he could not avoid hearing them. The pulsing of the waves had become the tidal chanting of the crowd as the fortunes of the racers ebbed and flowed within the stadium. While slaves were not, of course, permitted inside, they could follow on the giant holographic screens stuck to the outer walls. All eyes were riveted on these, which glittered with psychedelic colours. Whenever a racer pulled ahead, the wheels of her bike's hologram would bulge larger than life and become gilded, shrinking back to size as soon as she was overtaken. On the lintel of the main gate, the Greek words, "Be kind to Our Lady," were stencilled in large red letters. They entered beneath and ascended the stairwell within. Despite the stadium's otherwise iron and glass structure, the proconsular vestibule had been rendered in the late medieval post-ascension style. Its broad marble stairs were framed by high squinch arches, reminiscent of the Church of the Holy Wisdom itself. Over the last was a great painted icon of Our Lady of Battlement, descending from heaven as the demiurge, with the star of the Mother above her head. Beneath her feet lay the enemy's hammer and crescent, crushed and bleeding. Marcus bowed his head, touching his rosary to his lips. When he looked up, a large silhouette at the top of the stairs was framed against the stainless May sky. He didn't need to wait for his eyes to adjust to know who it was. The day was already taking a turn for the worse. His escort drew respectfully aside. "Chaire, my old friend, so good of you to grace us with your presence. I do hope your journey wasn't too arduous. I hear it's rather grim up there. We're all getting on, after all. The needs must." The silhouette addressed him sarcastically. It spoke Greek, but with a grating Germanic accent. The migraine renewed its assault. Marcus squinted, shielding his eyes. The silhouette moved down a step. 3 golden laurels on a red beret glinted in the sunshine as the shadow morphed into a well-built man in his late 40s with a shock of blonde hair. He wore the same dress uniform as Marcus, but towered head and shoulders over him, and the stairs weren't helping. The man smiled condescendingly. Flavian, the governor of Anglia, had never been a favourite of Marcus's. Perhaps it was his being an Alemannian, a people he'd always found ill-mannered, or maybe it was his being 10 years younger that grated. After all, while technically of equivalent rank under the proconsul of Britannia Major, no one seriously equated being Exarch of Anglia with being Exarch of Caledonia. Anglia had the provincial capital, and more legions. Flavian was ahead of him in the cursus, and he knew it. "Had the latest report?" Marcus asked, ignoring Flavian's question and dispensing with the customary salutation. Flavian smiled, implying that of course he had, and had far better understood its meaning than Marcus could ever hope to. "Oh yes, and it's got all of us in the propraetorium in quite a quandary," he said. He winked and made a crossing motion on his chest. Marcus glanced about apprehensively, which only increased Flavian's amusement. "Oh, come on now, my good fellow, lighten up. I hear it's one of yours today, isn't it?" he asked, laughing. If I heard right, claimed to be some kind of chieftain too, didn't he? To think, such effrontery from a pleb, and before such a respected magistrate too. Marcus was on the point of retorting that the man had been a nobody when Flavian gave him a hearty slap on the back. He stumbled into the light. A sea of 50,000 agitated faces rose before him, the furious waves of their cries crashing with new violence upon his ears, as two racing bikes, one red and one green, vied for top spot on the arena floor. They swerved and skidded around an obstacle course, jumping chasms and negotiating perilously narrow ledges. The fans on opposite sides of the stadium wore red and green tunics, their faces painted in the same national colours. At every turn, they leapt in and out of their seats, shouting the Greek victory cry of Nika, or chanting their team's slogans in Anglian or Gallic whenever their biker got ahead. A smaller number, in blue and yellow, sat dejectedly in the other corners of the stadium. Two bikes lay in a crushed heap beside one of the jump ramps. The bloodied bodies of two young women in riding gear of the same colours had been dragged to the edge of the arena, where medics were fruitlessly trying to revive them. The proconsular box was small, intended to accommodate only a limited number of dignitaries. 3 stories up, it was designed to be maximally visible. Its marble facade was also revetted in the old style, displaying a large golden star over the carved letters SPQM. Set into its ceiling was another star, this one made of glass and glowing with a lambent pale green light. To either side of the box was a giant holographic projection of a woman in military uniform. Each had enormous wings, whose feathered pinions rustled in the breeze, and huge spears, which they brandished at the sky as they cheered the racers on. Marcus and Flavian headed to the front row. In the middle was an empty throne with a star carved into it, to either side of which they seated themselves. The seats were wooden, with high backs, and rather uncomfortable. Flavian smiled unsubtly at Marcus's discomfort as they sat down. Kalimera, good day. May the Virgin protect you. Marcus exchanged the usual greeting in Greek with his neighbours. These were the governors of the other exarchates of Britannia Major, Gallia Minor in the west, and Thula in the outer islands. Both women in their 40s, they too wore the same white uniform with red cuffs. One Greek and the other Italic, both came from old families. There was nothing remarkable in that, just the usual careerists with a natural head start afforded by sex and birth. Neither seemed particularly interested in the fate of their teams, nor in Marcus. Several senior officials were already seated behind, logothetes and quaestors of the provincial consistoria. All wore grey dalmatic tunics, embroidered with a white star, differing only in the quantity of gold laurels on their lapels. A cluster of military legates, strategoi, and tribunes loitered by the stairwell, some holding glasses in their hands. No one seemed much interested in the spectacle below. The proconsul hadn't arrived yet. She was more of a concern. Argira Juba, the governor of Britannia Major, was a Numidian by birth. They had always been a proud people anyway, but to make matters worse, Argira's family, the Jubai, claimed to be one of the oldest in the empire. Like Flavian, she was about 10 years his junior. He wasn't sure whether he feared or loathed his boss more. One thing was clear though, she didn't much like him. To be fair, it was natural enough that any man in a senior office who was getting on should be frowned on. But it wasn't just that. Since the unfortunate events of last year, he'd had the unavoidable sense that he was suspected of something more concrete. At best, he was sure she thought him a dullard who wasn't passing muster. At worst, well, that didn't bear thinking about. Just looking at the empty chair beside him made him itch. By now the races had ended, but the crowd was still raucous. A lithe young woman was pacing around the perimeter, vaunting beneath the sparkling holograms of the sponsors. Her jersey lapels were crimson, contrasting with the green of her vanquished competitor, who sat dejectedly nearby. Red flags waved in the crowd. It was another win for the Angles. There was no surprise there. One demesman with a red-daubed face unfurled a banner which read, "Not angles, but angels." Seeing 2 Praetorians approaching, he dropped it and bolted. Their white caps showed that they belonged to the local Heresy Praetorium, which was out in full force today. Flavian laughed raucously and winked at Marcus, a sparkle in his eye. The victorious racer still wore her close-fitting leathers, but now removed her helmet to reveal a cascade of golden hair. She beamed up happily at the cheering crowd of Reds. Squatting, she shook her hair round and round in a sort of victory dance, brandishing her helmet in the air. One of the winged holograms beside the box mimicked her. Marcus imagined her blonde locks spinning above him on his bed in a contortion of slender limbs. He smiled to himself, but the pleasant distraction proved short-lived. A trumpet blared. He bolted upright as his migraine returned with a vengeance. He shifted about in the uncomfortable wooden seat, fingering his doublet cuffs. The proconsul had arrived.